Welcome to Not Two Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Polemics on Protracted People's War. Proletarians of all countries, unite. Right opportunists expose themselves. Belisario writes, quote, "It is laudable if, indeed, in 1982, Gonzalo was the very first to transcribe Mao Zedong thought to Maoism. It is another matter whether his supposed synthesis of Maoism would surpass the summing up by his own loyal Chinese comrades. By itself, the transcription from Mao Zedong thought to Maoism is not a great achievement. Marx berated Paul Lafargue in 1883 for using the term Marxism for revolutionary phase-mongering against the struggle for reforms. Even then, Karl Kautsky popularized the term Marxism and subsequently used it to deny the Marxist character of Lenin's theory and practice, which he termed Leninism." End quote. Neither we nor the Communist Party of Peru claim transcribing Mao Zedong thought to Maoism. What we discuss is content, not form. The form should match the content, but the ism character of Maoism is not a question of transcribing. What is important is content, not the word, as is stated by the Communist Party of Brazil Red Faction in their document Combat Liquidationism and Unite the International Communist Movement under Maoism and the People's War, where they write, quote, "It is not enough to recognize that Maoism is a third stage. A correct definition of its content is necessary. Without a correct definition of its fundamental elements, there cannot be a correct application." End quote. This is what is important. This is what this discussion is about. Is the theory of People's War part of the fundamental elements of Maoism, as the Communist Party of Peru stated, as the Communist Party of Brazil Red Faction is stating, and as is stated by the parties and organizations of Latin America initiating the unification of the international communist movement under Maoism? Belisario and Sison do not agree, and resort to sinister attacks, slander, and mockery to get this point through to us and all others. They now stand exposed. On the contributions and great leadership of Chairman Gonzalo. Belisario writes, quote, "To differentiate Maoism from Mao Zedong thought is to nitpick and invent a false distinction. Even Gonzalo used the phrase Mao Zedong thought until 1982. Whichever term is used, we certainly have no need for the dubious genius of a Gonzalo to comprehend or synthesize or canonize or reinvent it anew for the world's benefit. He could not have added to the achievements of Mao himself after his death in 1976. It is pure nonsense to make it appear that the continuous significance and consequentiality of Mao's theory and practice depend on the words of Gonzalo." End quote. Again dripping with venom, Belisario's stance is clear. There is no difference between Mao Zedong thought and Maoism, and it was fully understood by the international communist movement way ahead of 1976. To further synthesize and understand, in Belisario's view, adds no value. The contributions of Mao must then simply be a summation of all his writings and efforts, or maybe the synthesis acknowledged by the Communist Party of China before the death of Mao. We do not agree, as we have made very clear. Belisario writes, quote, "As dogmatists and sectarians of the worst kind, they use such expressions as Gonzalo is the greatest after Mao, sounding like evangelists who proclaim Jesus is the Lord. Mistaking struggle mania for revolutionary struggle, they are quick to throw invectives and do not really engage in a serious substantive debate. Gonzalo thought, as painted by Quinera, is not ideology, but idology." End quote. We do not find the word ideology in the dictionary. Maybe the word Belisario is looking for is Khrushchev Pravda's idolatry, which they slung against the Communist Party of China and their leader Mao Zedong. Belisario is not quoting us, but we adhere to the understanding of Gonzalo as the greatest living communist. Maybe the position of Belisario is that Sison is the greatest. Or maybe he is of the opinion that there has been no greatest among great communist leaders since the death of Mao. We do not know. It is the way of the right opportunist not taking a clear position. Our position in this question is the logical conclusion from adhering to the understanding of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, principally Maoism, as it was made clear by the Communist Party of Peru and Chairman Gonzalo. It has nothing to do with religious metaphysics when we uphold a communist leader to be great. The role of the Communist Party of Peru has been of great significance far from the Andes, where they hoisted the red banner of Maoism in 1980. We acknowledge them to have advanced Maoism to its, by now, highest level. To hide this acknowledgement would be cowardice. Belisario writes, quote, Quinera and his fellow dogmatists and sectarians are incapable of recognizing the egotism, immodesty, and arrogance of certain leaders who wish to proclaim their universal greatness even before winning the revolution in their own country, and who actually brand their own theories and practices with their own names, like Gonzalo thought, Prachanda path, and Avakian synthesis to proclaim himself the great leader of the new wave after MLM, end quote. Belisario and his promoter Sison would then equal the traitor Prachanda and the tragic figure Avakian with Chairman Gonzalo. Falsely, he claims Gonzalo to proclaim himself a leader of a wave after Maoism, even though Gonzalo repeatedly states Gonzalo thought to be Maoism applied to the Peruvian Revolution, and thus part of the third stage, not a fourth one. Belisario calls this egoism, immodesty, and arrogance, since the People's War in Peru has not yet won victory in the whole of Peru, but failing to mention that the guiding thought of Mao was acknowledged before the victory in 1949. Was this egoism and arrogance? Further on, he does not engage with the reasoning made by the Communist Party of Peru when they explain the relation between guiding thought and a great leader, and the understanding of the historical law that every revolution must produce a guiding thought and a great leadership to be victorious, and that is, in essence, about the concrete application of the universal Maoism on the concrete revolution. Belisario equates Prachanda path to Gonzalo thought on a very superficial basis of their names. If we try to look into the essence of Prachanda path, its right opportunism is not only contrary to Gonzalo thought, but it applies the same forms of right opportunist trickery as Sison and Belisario do. Under pretext of applying revolutionary theory to the particularities of a country, they give cover for right opportunism. And they only use the particularities to turn revolutionary struggle into legalism and reformism. Opportunism is eclectic, and as such, it does not take the same pride in its history. It dishonestly uses the achievements of great communists of the past, like Marx, Lenin, and Mao, as well as people shedding blood for the revolution today, as a way to put themselves in a better light, always weaving it into their argumentation so as not to reveal the sinister attacks on the revolutionary movement they are committing. Great communists like Gonzalo build upon the great achievements and innovations of communists before them and the struggles of the masses. It is a necessity that it be so. But the opportunists have the option of eclectically rejecting the counter-revolutionary role they have played throughout history, even condemning parts of it. But if we use Maoism to reveal the essence of right opportunism, then it puts Prachanda path and Belisario in the same camp, whatever Belisario claims. And further, as the Avakianites attack Maoism and negate it with their new synthesis, as Prachanda negates every fundamental principle of Marxism with his integration in the reactionary state, this is by far not the case of Gonzalo and the Communist Party of Peru. And, contrary to the Avakianites, the synthesis of Gonzalo thought is not elusive and thus impossible to grasp. It is stated quite clearly in the documents of the party itself. While getting Avakianites to explain the concept of Avakian's new synthesis is an opening for a nonsensical mush. And even further, to compare Avakian's achievements to the People's War of Peru would be laughable, if it did not display a cynical contempt of the shed blood of the masses and their party and leadership, which is alien to any communist and should provoke nothing but anger. Prachanda's liquidation of the glorious People's War of Nepal is, in this matter, greater than Avakian, but also more reactionary and criminal. This traitor with his diplomacy, negotiations, and parliamentary cretinism should serve as a concrete warning of where the path of right opportunism and eclecticism leads. The problem was not the form of Prachanda path, but the right opportunist content. We don't give a damn about who is the most arrogant or most humble. If Khrushchev had lived in a shack tending to his humility, bear with this fantasy for one moment, he would still be the greatest traitor of his time and a criminal in the eyes of the international communist movement. Both in defense and offense, Belisario fails to differentiate. He fails to differentiate between great leaders, and he fails to differentiate between great criminals. And sometimes he confuses them altogether. It is nothing new. It is the way of right opportunism. A black attack on the People's War in Peru. Belisario writes, quote, "Let us focus on the idol of Quinera. Gonzalo may be praised for founding the PCP, Sendero Luminoso, in 1969 under the guidance of Mariátegui and Mao Zedong thought. But despite his belief that People's War can be started at the drop of a hat, Quinera does not take Gonzalo to task for being a sluggard, starting the People's War only in 1980, 11 years after the PCP-SL founding, so different from the CP of the Philippines, being founded on December 26, 1968, and starting the People's War on March 29, 1969, 3 months after the CPP founding." End quote. Again, one wants to ask, who is this Belisario? Who came up with such a paragraph? It is impossible to engage such writing in a serious way. It shows nothing but contempt for the very real blood that has been shed, both in the Philippines and in Peru. For the honest reader, we emphasize that the main question is not when to start, but to start. And before starting, it is about defining, contrary to not defining. That is, to pose the question correctly and make the first steps towards preparation. Belisario writes, quote, "Despite his gross failures at building the United Front as a political weapon from 1969 to 1992, Gonzalo may still be praised for engaging in the building of the party and the People's Guerrilla Army up to the late 1980s, when, without respect for the facts of the revolutionary armed struggle, he invented the illusion of strategic equilibrium and proceeded to seek a left opportunist shortcut to victory through urban insurrection. Inasmuch as he abhors stages, Quinera can praise Gonzalo for disregarding the probable stages in the development of protracted People's War as previously defined by Mao. But Gonzalo is a gross violator of Mao's teachings on protracted People's War." End quote. Again, Belisario writes of People's War as a Yankee writes movie reviews, with a complete contempt for the real lives and real blood, and also of the real dangers, hardships, leadership, and organization. The claim of a failure to build the United Front does not correspond with reality and the large number of mass organizations and people's committees generated and led by the party. How could they wage such a war without it? It would be impossible. The stage of strategic equilibrium was real, as indicated by the Yankee Congress debating the People's War, the direct involvement of Yankee imperialism on the highest levels, and the Fujimori coup of 1992. New York Times in March 22 of 1992 wrote, quote, "In Congress, the State Department, the Organization of American States, and private research and human rights organizations, the sense is growing that the astonishing momentum being shown by the Shining Path rebellion in Peru is the toughest post-Cold War policy test on the horizon for the Western Hemisphere. Quote, put out of your mind the FMLN, the Sandinistas, the M-19 of Colombia, and other South American insurgencies," end quote, Bernard W. Aronson, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, told a recent congressional hearing. Quote, "Sendero Luminoso is in a category by itself," end quote, end quote. When Mao defines where the strategic defensive ends and the strategic stalemate begins, he writes, quote, "The second stage may be termed one of strategic stalemate. At the tail end of the first stage, the enemy will be forced to fix certain terminal points to his strategic offensive owing to his shortage of troops and our firm resistance, and upon reaching them, he will stop his strategic offensive and enter the stage of safeguarding his occupied areas." End quote. This is the tipping point of these two stages. We do not act as if we had studied the People's War in Peru in all its aspects, but to us, it does not at all seem like Chairman Gonzalo was wrong to understand the transition from strategic defensive to strategic stalemate. At least, if Belisario claims it is so, he should really explain why. At the stage he mentions, the old state was in crisis in Peru. This is known to all experts. The People's War was raging in all parts of the country. The new power controlled almost half the country. There were armed actions in the whole country. The activity was simmering also in Lima. The Yankee imperialists discussed the matter on congressional levels, deployed forces in Peru, and President Fujimori made a coup to fight the People's War more efficiently. It seems very much the enemy of the old state was entering a stage mainly safeguarding their areas, and thus the stage of strategic stalemate or equilibrium. On the sinister claim that Gonzalo has capitulated. Belisario writes, quote, "After his capture in 1992, Gonzalo was quick to capitulate to the Fujimori regime and become a right opportunist by offering peace negotiations and a peace agreement with the regime, causing costly splits among the members and supporters of the PCP-SL. Since then, the infantile Maoists have made a blanket denial of Gonzalo's capitulation and right opportunism, despite subsequent manifestations of the truth since 1993, such as his public TV appearance, confirmation by his wife, and testimonies of his lawyer who visited him weekly. On this basis, RIM started to become critical of Gonzalo's behavior." End quote. Our position is one with the position of the international communist movement, as in the statement in defense of the life of Chairman Gonzalo, Hoist Higher the Flag of Maoism of 2018. Quote, "There are those that until now insist on spreading the counter-revolutionary hoax that Chairman Gonzalo is the head of the opportunist, revisionist, and capitulationist right opportunist line. They argue with what was stated by traitors, he told me or he embraced me in other gossip, with what was controlled by imperialism and the psychological warfare of the reaction, courts, and filtered videos. Anything that comes from whoever wants to throw mud at Chairman Gonzalo supposedly has to be taken very seriously, has to be analyzed, and has to break our heads to enter into a discussion whether or not it is him. They are wrong, because they do not understand that the debate has already been closed. The communists have already taken a position, and the matter is settled. It was demonstrated that Chairman Gonzalo has not denied the party unity base of the PCP for a moment. He is the great leader of the party and the revolution, the greatest living Marxist-Leninist Maoist on the face of the earth, keeping on struggling to transform the concentration camp of Callao Navy Base into the most shining trench of combat of the People's War. What corresponds is to defend his life with People's War. 26 years have already passed in which Chairman Gonzalo could not directly communicate with the party or the ICM. 26 years of absolute isolation. This is what it concretely is. That imperialism, the reaction, and revisionism will continue to plot intrigues is clear. The contrary would be that they have changed their nature, a thesis of the disciples of the sacred Avakian, which is impossible. But we must not allow that these intrigues stop the advance of the communists." End quote. The Maoist Communist Party of France writes, on this question in the article, "To defend the life of Chairman Gonzalo is to defend Maoism," quote, "1 year after Chairman Gonzalo's arrest in 1992. In 1993, Peru's chairman, Alberto Fujimori, now imprisoned for crimes against humanity, responsible for a genocidal policy against the revolutionary movement, including the forced sterilization of thousands of indigenous women accused of procreating communists, presented false letters of peace attributed to Gonzalo, and soon after, counterfeit videos. This was evident to all communists and was revealed later by the secret services. The entire international Maoist movement led an intense campaign for the release of Chairman Gonzalo after his arrest. All requests by prominent progressive personalities to visit Chairman Gonzalo were rejected." End quote. We add, on our own note, that it is a matter of principle to us not to accept any capitulation from comrades in the hands of the enemy. We will view all such messages as false. If we did not, this would place an impossible burden on the movement to sort out what is true and what is false, as long as our comrades are in the sole hands of the enemy. Secondly, it would place all our prisoners of war in immense danger. If the enemy knew the movement to accept such statements, they would apply all types of pressure on the prisoners. Parties and organizations who accept such capitulation should be prepared to bear an enormous responsibility. They might end up with blood on their hands and heavy weights of responsibility on their shoulders. In the final report of the bourgeois so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, even these lapdogs of the old state admit the torture practices of the police. Quote, "The TRC concludes that the fight against subversion reinforced pre-existing authoritarian and repressive practices among members of the police. Torture during interrogations and undue detentions, which had been frequent in addressing common delinquency, acquired a massive character during the counter-subversive action. Additionally, the TRC has established that the most serious human rights violations by military agents were extrajudicial executions, forced disappearance of persons, torture, and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The TRC particularly condemns the extensive practice of sexual violence against women." End quote. The TRC admits massacres and other atrocities, and the massacres of heroic fighting revolutionaries in the prisons is well known to us, and will forever be remembered as the day of heroism. Just to put emphasis on the character of the old state, we quote the Bourgeois Human Rights Watch, who writes, quote, "In 2015, the government created a national registry of victims of forced sterilizations committed between 1995 and 2001. More than 5,000 victims have been registered at time of writing." End quote. In this context, Belisario states, quote, "Gonzalo was quick to capitulate to the Fujimori regime and become a right opportunist." End quote. And by quick, he is referring to a year in solitary isolation, in a cell defined as Spartan by the butcher President Fujimori himself, his wife-to-be and several comrades in other cells, in the hands of the same torturing enemy. And this filth is being promoted by the ILPS chairman and NDFP advisor, Jose Maria Sison. Against empiricism, subjectivism, and dogmatism. If we move from Belisario's criticism to summing up the main problem of his right opportunist method, we want to address his empiricism, which, in essence, is anti-Maoist. It is basic Marxism that practice is principle in the contradiction of theory and practice. Knowledge develops from practice, this is principle. But this should not be understood as putting no emphasis at all on theory or rational knowledge. It is basic Maoism that, quote, "from the particular to the general," end quote. But this is but the first of two processes, whereas the second is, quote, "from the general to the particular," end quote, as Mao explained in On Contradiction. A one-sided emphasis on the particular, on the concrete socio-economic characteristics, on the objective conditions, on the revolutionary situation, does not develop rational knowledge from the practice. It does not do what Mao describes like this. Quote, "Thus, cognition always moves in cycles, and, so long as scientific method is strictly adhered to, each cycle advances human knowledge a step higher, and so makes it more and more profound." End quote. Chairman Gonzalo also addresses this question when he states, quote, "Pay attention to analysis and synthesis. These are two aspects of a contradiction, and synthesis is the principal one. Analysis allows us to break down and set elements apart in order to achieve a better understanding, but this is only one aspect. It is not, nor can it ever be, the entire process of knowledge. It requires the other aspect, synthesis. It is synthesis which enables us to grasp the essence of knowledge. If there is no synthesis, there is no qualitative leap in knowledge. Synthesis is the decisive aspect, the main aspect, the one which enables the formulation of objective laws." End quote. Belisario and Sison end up short-wiring the whole Marxist cycle of knowledge when they refuse to work seriously with the question of what is general, what is universal. Belisario boldly declares, in defiance of the whole Marxist method, quote, "These communist leaders did not set out to synthesize a universally applicable theory," end quote. And he pretends there is an antagonistic contradiction between such synthesis, a word he puts in scare quotes, as if he even questions the mere concept of synthesis, and the, quote, "concrete analysis of concrete conditions and carefully applied theory," end quote. This is a total rejection of the Marxist theory of knowledge, a serious error, and ends up as a blatant rejection of the entire body of work produced by the great communists Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Gonzalo. And at the same time, there's hardly any concrete and precise socio-economical analysis in the articles put forth by Belisario and Sison. All this talk of concrete analysis of the concrete situation is simply replacing such, and not followed by such. The empiricist error thus transforms into dogmatism. We see this when Belisario eclectically handpicks quotes from Lenin's left-wing communism without even a sentence on the concrete socio-economical situation and the historical context in which it was written. Nor does he address the context of this work in relation to the subjective forces, where this pamphlet was part of Lenin's struggle against anarcho-syndicalism, National Bolshevism, and different anti-authoritarian factionalists and splinters in Russia, Germany, and Britain in 1920, a situation where Marxism had won the most advanced proletarians, and the task at hand was to combat factionalism, and, as Mao said, quote, "raise the level of the intermediate," end quote. This is a concrete situation that has not been replicated in the imperialist fortresses for many decades. Or does Belisario really believe we are in a similar situation in imperialist Europe 2019 as Lenin and the communists of 1920? But in the end, what the pamphlet on left-wing communism absolutely is not is a critique of people's war theory as the universally applicable military theory of the proletariat. Neither Belisario nor Sison seem interested in solving any problems. They seem focused on inventing new problems and making the least amount of real investigation. They thus again discard the Marxist theory of knowledge, where Mao states that to investigate a problem is to solve it. They criticize others for dogmatism and phrasemongering, but they themselves have little other than empty talk to present. They attack form, person, and words, instead of bringing real matters to discussion. They talk about concrete analysis, but replace any analysis with hollowed-out phrases and nasty words. Again, Belisario and Sison are totally embedded in empiricism in this matter, that is, the matter of proletarian military theory and universality of people's war. They are subjective and one-sided. And this transforms into dogmatism at the first theoretical obstacle. It is good that they expose themselves, but it is of no use if this is not acknowledged and understood in the international communist movement. Their wrecking ways are dangerous if one lets them get their foot inside the door. We will learn this lesson and be vigilant in the future. To discard people's war is to discard proletarian revolution. Part 2. Ard Quinera, Red Flag Editorial Group. 25 September 2019. Quote, Chairman Mao emphasized that we must always be concerned about revisionism because it is the main danger facing the world revolution. So we also take into consideration the situation outside our ranks, since any rightist tendency in the party, expressed in attitudes, ideas, approaches, and positions of a rightist nature, has to do with ideological processes, with the repercussions of the class struggle, and the campaigns of the reactionary state, with the actions of revisionism itself in our country, with the counter-revolutionary activities of imperialism, especially the contention between the two superpowers and the sinister role of revisionism on a world scale." End quote. Chairman Gonzalo, in the El Diario interview of 1988. This is the second part of a longer article. In dividing into two, we tried to focus the first part on issues of burning importance and place most secondary issues in the second part. We also put some paragraphs here that deal with issues that have been addressed earlier by Art Quinera or other Maoists. All references in the article as a whole are attached to both parts. People's War was not synthesized by Marx or Lenin. Belisario writes, quote, "Marx and Engels had long developed this theory on the necessity of armed revolution by the masses of toiling people led by the working class, further clarifying the need to smash the existing bourgeois state machinery and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat in order to pursue and complete the socialist revolution." So, yes, in this sense, there should be no debate about the universal applicability of People's War in all countries ruled by the big bourgeoisie and its reactionary allies. Had Quinera kept his polemics within these bounds, about People's War being the equivalent of armed revolution, then there would be essentially no debate on the question. End quote. This is certainly true. But the point is, People's War was not developed, not synthesized by Marx or Lenin, but by Mao, and later made part of the definition of Maoism by Chairman Gonzalo. If People's War did not mean People's War, as understood by Mao and then Maoists, but simply was another word for something else, then yes, Belisario would be correct. Then there would be no debate. And also, there might not even be Maoism. Maoism was understood in the furnace of People's War in Peru. Without People's War, no Maoism, and no Maoism without People's War. The Communist Party of Peru writes in On Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, part of their fundamental documents, quote, "The People's War is the military theory of the international proletariat. In it are summarized, for the first time in a systematic and complete form, the theoretical and practical experience of the struggles, military actions, and wars waged by the proletariat, and the prolonged experience of the people's armed struggle, and especially of the incessant wars in China. It is with Chairman Mao that the proletariat attains its military theory. Nevertheless, there is much confusion and misunderstanding on this issue." End quote. We understand perfectly clearly why Belisario and Sison prefer to attack us instead of addressing the CPP and Gonzalo directly. But wouldn't it be more honest if they did? Or if they answered the documents of the El Maoista, or the Maoist parties and organizations of Latin America, or the Communist Party of Brazil Red Faction? No, they prefer directing the articles against us, while the attack in reality is against the red line put forward by these great parties and organizations. It is transparent why they do so, and comrades should make a note of this. To be blunt, they do so because they think this is a good tactic. One more of their special so-called tactics. On the other hand, the contradiction is still made very clear. Belisario is promoting a right opportunist line. On strategy and revolutionary situations. Belisario writes, quote, "However, Quinera glosses over two important corollaries to this fundamental principle of Marxism-Leninism. First, his arguments assume, even though not directly, that a revolutionary situation currently or perennially exists in all countries. Therefore, all communist parties, CPs, if they are truly engaged in revolution, must adopt a corresponding military strategy and place armed struggle on their practical work agenda. And second, he insists that the Maoist strategy of protracted people's war is applicable to industrial capitalist countries. End quote. To clear this misunderstanding, we simply adhere to Chairman Mao and Chairman Gonzalo. As Mao stated, the main tendency of our time is revolution. This is the era of proletarian revolution and the demise of imperialism. As stated in the international line of the Communist Party of Peru, quote, "In the current situation and in perspective, we have entered the strategic offensive of the world revolution, within the 50 to 100 years in which imperialism and world reaction shall be sunk, and we shall enter the stage when the proletariat settles into power and establishes its dictatorship." End quote. Every act in this era, for the communist, is conducted for the People's War. Our position is not that there is a permanent revolutionary situation in each and every country. But it is our position that the revolution in all countries take form of People's War, and is part of the proletarian world revolution. The military theory of the proletariat is not a strategy for a revolutionary situation. It is a theory that is an integral part of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism. It is simply the sole and only military theory of the proletariat, on which all revolutionary strategy must be based. Communists must indeed place armed struggle on the agenda, both in theory and practice. It cannot wait for the revolutionary situation to appear. First, it must be defined, then prepared, then initiated, and then developed, in each and every country. Chairman Mao in the People's War. Contrary to the obscure and subjectivist distortions of Belisario, there is no coincidence in the term Maoism. Chairman Mao was the great leader who developed the guiding thought of the Chinese Revolution, and through it, he developed Marxism in its three realms: philosophy, economy, and socialism. And he developed the theory of People's War. These are objective facts that are also acknowledged by bourgeois military theorists like Thomas Marx, as Quinera wrote in an earlier article. They do not propose that Mao's works are only relevant to the insurgency in semi-colonial and semi-feudal countries. Instead, their position mirrors, from the bourgeois side, the position of Maoists, that hold People's War to be universal, or unavoidable, when the question of revolution is raised. In this question, it is of no relevance if this was fully grasped by Mao himself in 1938. Firstly, because Mao lived on for almost 40 more years, and in these 4 decades, he led the victory in the People's War of China, the socialist construction, and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. He led the charge against modern revisionism in the form of Khrushchev, and was recognized as the leader of the international communist movement. And Mao Zedong thought inspired countless parties and organizations all over the world, and more than a few revolutionary wars. How these 4 decades formed or inspired Mao's thoughts is yet to be studied by us. It is obvious that the first letters to the revisionist leadership of the Soviet Union in the Great Polemic differ quite a bit from the last ones. Also, the letters on Togliatti and Torre show what great lengths the Chinese leadership went to in the struggle to maintain unity while fighting right opportunism in the movement. There is development, and this development culminated in the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, an all-out war on revisionism and capitalist roaders. We do not have the full picture of the development in the military thought of Mao from 1938 till the peak of the Cultural Revolution 30 years later. But there must have been some leaps in his understanding. Anyhow, Maoism as synthesized by the CPP and Chairman Gonzalo includes the military theory of Mao as an integral part and as being universal. What the bourgeois Yankee Thomas Marx understands, Belisario does not. People's War is the theory of insurgency. It is the military theory of proletarian world revolution and its 2 currents, the National Liberation Movement and the Proletarian Movement. As the Communist Party of Peru writes in On Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, quote, A key and decisive question is the understanding of the universal validity of People's War and its subsequent application, taking into account the different types of revolution and the specific conditions of each revolution. To clarify this key issue, it is important to consider that no insurrection like that of Petrograd, the anti-fascist resistance, or the European guerrilla movements in the Second World War have been repeated, as well as considering the armed struggles that are presently being waged in Europe. In the final analysis, the October Revolution was not only an insurrection, but a revolutionary war that lasted for several years. Consequently, in the imperialist countries, the revolution can only be conceived as a revolutionary war, which today is simply People's War." End quote. As the reader might notice, the party does not refer to a quotation of Mao to argue the universality of People's War, but it argues reality. It sums up the experience of the national liberation movement and the proletarian revolution in the light of Mao's theory. It points out the fact that there has been no, lacking a better word, Petrograd style of revolution since the Russian Revolution. And, importantly, they understand also this revolution as People's War, lasting several years. They refer to the armed struggles of Europe, like the Irish armed struggle still being waged, as something to be considered in understanding the universal validity of People's War. We do not want to fall into some kind of imperial criticism like Belisario later does, but still remembering the words of Mao in his article on practice, quote, "Marxists hold that man's social practice alone is the criterion of the truth of his knowledge of the external world." End quote. Belisario goes on explaining Sison and denouncing People's War in imperialist countries. Quote, "Sison's point is that in the highly urbanized and other highly developed areas of capitalist countries, under current conditions, when there is no full-scale war and revolutionary crisis, a people's army that launches tactical offensives with no sizable mass base, at least equivalent to rural guerrilla bases in countries such as China and Vietnam, will be hard-pressed to counter-maneuver, employ guerrilla tactics, retain initiative, and hit back at the enemy's weak points, and much less be able to consolidate and expand their bases." End quote. We hold this statement to be proven false by the Irish Republican Army, waging such a guerrilla war for many decades against a British imperialism not under conditions of full-scale war and revolutionary crisis. The statement is simply proven wrong by man's social practice. Further on, as we have referred to before, there is experience of armed struggle in most imperialist countries, both during war and fascism, and not. Further on, many semi-feudal and semi-colonial countries are today highly urbanized. The communications of such countries are highly developed today compared to rural China in 1938. Still, the People's War continues in the Philippines, India, Turkey, and Peru. In Nepal, the People's War raged for 10 years and engulfed 80% of the country from 1996 to 2006. This in a small country situated between two hostile giants, China and India. Even though the People's War was betrayed by the leadership who entered parliamentary cretinism and succumbed to bureaucratic capitalism, it proved the universality of People's War again. We mention here 5 countries distinctly different from China of 1938. From specific to universal. From particular to general. Further, we must point out that what is a specific characteristic of one revolution might later become acknowledged as universally applicable. One such example we find when Stalin writes about the strategy and tactics of the October Revolution. Here he points out 2 specific characteristics, the first being, quote, "Thus, the undivided leadership of one party, the Communist Party, as the principal factor in the preparation for October, such is the characteristic feature of the October Revolution. Such is the first specific feature of the tactics of the Bolsheviks in the period of preparation for October." End quote. Would not this become an integral and universally applicable part of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism? We claim it is, and that this is understood and acknowledged by every Maoist. In this text of Stalin, we see how he with greatness elaborates on this specific characteristic of the Russian Revolution, different from the experience of the Paris Commune, but this characteristic feature was then replicated in China and in all other people's wars later on. What was applied as specific has been proven universal. This is an example of the Marxist spiral of knowledge. From the practice to theory to new enriched practice to new enriched theory. What Stalin presents as a specific characteristic in this text from 1923, he includes in his writing of his synthesis of Marxism-Leninism, the second and higher stage of Marxism, in the Eternal article concerning questions of Leninism, written in 1926. Quote, Lenin uses the word dictatorship of the party not in the strict sense of the word, power based on the use of force, but in the figurative sense, in the sense of its undivided leadership, end quote. Stalin does not here talk about Leninism as specific for Russia, but defines it like this in The Foundations of Leninism. Quote, Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular, end quote. Make note of how unapologetically Stalin not only says theory, but also tactics. Stalin cannot be a great communist in Belisario's view, since such only, quote, carefully applied theory to grapple with the specific characteristics of their own countries and solve concrete problems of their own revolutions, end quote, and, quote, did not set out to synthesize a universally applicable theory on how to wage armed revolution, end quote. Stalin writes in The Foundations of Leninism, quote, Some say that Leninism is the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to the situation in Russia. This definition contains a particle of truth, but not the whole truth by any means. Lenin indeed applied Marxism to Russian conditions, and applied it in a masterly way. But if Leninism were only the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to Russia, it would be a purely national and only a national, a purely Russian and only a Russian phenomenon. We know, however, that Leninism is not merely a Russian but an international phenomenon, rooted in the whole of international development. That is why I think this definition suffers from one-sidedness, end quote. The development of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism follows the principles of the cycle of knowledge as described by Mao in On Contradiction. Quote, These are the two processes of cognition. One, from the particular to the general, and the other from the general to the particular. Thus, cognition always moves in cycles, and, so long as scientific method is strictly adhered to, each cycle advances human knowledge a step higher, and so makes it more and more profound, end quote. The concrete application is the particular, and the summing up of experience, systematizing it, and making a synthesis to find what is general, what is universal, and thus to advance human knowledge. Stalin continues, quote, Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular, end quote. One gets the notion Belisario and Sison are amongst those who believe the process of developing the Marxist theory of universal laws and of tactics and strategy of the proletarian revolution in general was finished sometime around these writings of Stalin. Belisario admits that, quote, the basic principle of armed revolution by the proletariat and other allied classes were further elaborated by Lenin in his many works, end quote. But he does not grant Mao the same status. In other words, the principles of armed revolution have not been developed further since Lenin, or at least since Stalin synthesized these, if Belisario even recognizes Stalin's synthesis of Leninism. If so, Belisario's article on, quote, the so-called universality of People's War, end quote, should be the perfect occasion to at least mention the universal contributions of Mao in the era of revolutionary war. But when given the opportunity, Belisario uses it only to make Mao, quote, one of many, end quote, in the company of 3 Vietnamese leaders and José María Sison. Sison himself, in the texts of Philippine Society and Revolution, 1970, says, quote, "The fundamental strategic line of fighting for national democracy as the first stage in the longer-term struggle for socialism had still to be firmly grasped by the Philippine left. Almost 15 years after the 1949 victory of the Chinese Revolution led by Mao had overwhelmingly reaffirmed the universal validity of Lenin's revolutionary strategy for semi-colonial, semi-feudal societies," end quote. And, quote, "The Philippine Revolution is today illuminated by the great universal truth of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought," end quote. These are the words of Belisario's promoter Sison nearly 50 years ago. How does this compare to the writings of Belisario and Sison today? And our point here is not to focus on the content, but the method. On the one hand, today, Sison salutes the Bolivarian government in Venezuela, upholding Chavez and Maduro. So it seems People's War and New Democracy is not universal in the semi-colonial and semi-feudal countries either, in his opinion. Not anymore. What revolutionary parties in the imperialist countries apply electoralism today? Belisario writes, after some juvenile slander, quote, "In short, Cunera disdains the work in reactionary trade unions and bourgeois parliaments that Lenin, in left-wing communism and other works, had so patiently explained as an important part of revolutionary tasks during a non-revolutionary period," end quote. Again, Belisario does not argue facts when he argues. As he simply refers to Mao, he now simply refers to Lenin. Why is this thesis of Lenin in 1920 true in 2019? The point made of Chairman Mao and Chairman Gonzalo is that our era is not the same as in 1920. They claim this is the era of sweeping away of imperialism. And Gonzalo states it is the strategic offensive of the proletarian world revolution. In this era, we have 8 decades more experience since Lenin wrote his book against the infantile disorder of left communism, just as we have 6 decades more experience since Mao's main work on protracted war. Have we not learned anything from this experience worth summing up? On the one hand, Belisario claims all the classics wrote almost purely for their own particular and specific situations. On the other hand, he treats what they wrote, but only arbitrarily, as some dogma never to be questioned. What a gymnastics performance! Yes, we disdain the practice of the proletarian revolutionaries of Belisario's, patiently accumulating strength, because we know too well what these coded words really mean. But Belisario does not mention these patient revolutionaries. Who are they? Which parties and organizations in the imperialist countries does he have in mind? We know which revolutionaries are engulfed in elections and trade unions run by the Social Democrats. We do not believe for a second that they are really paving the way for proletarian revolution. They willingly give their names, pictures, and addresses to the class enemy. They do not study military theory. Ask them, Belisario, what tactics and strategies they have for revolution, and they will only present tactics of gathering votes. And most of them do not even succeed very well in this. Let it be clear that our disdain is not for the heroic fighters and cadre of the Communist Party of the Philippines, even though we disagree with the line of Sison and the line of participation in elections. We have nothing but the utmost respect for their sacrifice, and wish their struggle to succeed. We also respect all comrades that disagree or have questions in these matters. We are not too arrogant to see where we come from, what errors we have made ourselves, and our shortcomings. But we have no respect for the parliamentary cretinism of the legalist left of the imperialist countries. This is a comfortable choice in our countries. It is the path of least resistance, but it does not lead to revolution. The decades have spoken. Their practice is known. They are being integrated into the reactionary state, or they are withering away of old age. Belisario writes, quote, "Sison's remark about not seeing any Maoist party proclaiming and actually starting PPW in imperialist countries was obviously to show that truly serious Maoist formations in these countries see such course of immediate action as not viable for now. Quinera's response to this is dishonest and disingenuous. He basically challenges Sison to publicly reveal any Maoist party not adhering to the strategy of People's War and being of such quantity and quality. Note that he dropped the word protracted. This is a cunning trap, end quote. It is no trap. It is simply asking for some direct and honest talk. What parties and organizations do Belisario and Sison support in the imperialist countries? Preferably Maoist, not adhering to the universality of People's War, of some quantity and quality, and doing patient parliamentary and trade union work. If there is such a party, it should be easy for Belisario to remember or promote it. Where is it? On tactical unity and Bolshevik bank robbers. Belisario writes, quote, he simply condemns it as the total dominating strategy of practically all left forces in Europe, including those that adhere to Mao Zedong thought, but not Gonzaloites. This shows that Quinera is a hopeless infantile sectarian, who cannot even derive good points of tactical unity with other revolutionaries and progressives who do not kowtow to Gonzalo thought, end quote. Belisario's point, if there is one, is lost on us. We do not define anyone as Gonzaloite. It is simply a derogatory term. Why should we seek tactical unity with those who find us infantile and speak of your dear Gonzalo, and similar ways to mock Chairman Gonzalo? By all means, mock us all you want. But the slander against Gonzalo speaks volumes to what kind of dark agenda Belisario is pushing. We have no problem uniting in alliances and fronts with most people we have some disagreements with. But in the two-line struggle, when we struggle over revolutionary theory, we do not make tactical unity with right opportunism. We don't blur facts for tactical purposes. We are not debating the basis of unity for a single street protest, but the general line of the international communist movement. Belisario writes, quote, Quinera thus dishonestly conjures an illusion of a continuous PPW in a capitalist country. He conveniently forgets about the years of reaction, 1907 to 1910, when the revolution was in full retreat, and the years of revival, 1910 to 1914, when the Bolsheviks pursued tactics combining illegal work, but not yet armed struggle, with the obligatory utilization of many legal channels, including winning seats in the reactionary parliament, end quote. In 1907 and the years after, Bolshevik armed groups did many actions in the Caucasus, amongst them robberies and attacks on reactionaries. Is this not armed struggle? Was it only in the Caucasus such actions took place? Lenin and Stalin were linked to one of the largest heists in contemporary Europe. Not armed struggle? The Bolsheviks waged both legal and illegal struggle, also armed struggle, in 1904 and 1905. Also in the period of reaction and war, and from 1917 to 1921, it was insurrections, civil war, and national liberation war. Is it dishonest to view this as protracted People's War? To view it as protracted, and not a quick insurrection after prolonged accumulation of forces? We do not see the dishonesty on our part. On the industrial and non-industrial proletariat. Belisario writes, quote, Quinera claims that those employed in public or private services outnumber the industrial proletarians in most imperialist countries, end quote. He must be reminded that the modern industrial proletariat includes such service workers, insofar as their class situation is most analogous to industrial workers, end quote. This Belisario writes to defend Sison's words in the matter. This is not a central issue in our text, but if they want to not create confusion, they could simply say proletariat and not industrial proletariat. In his own class analysis of the Philippines, Sison writes, quote, the proletariat refers principally to the industrial workers and secondarily to other wage earners, and, quote, The industrial workers are in land, water, and rail transport, mines and quarries, logging areas and lumber yards, sugar, coconut, and abaca stripping mills, public utility plants, food processing, beverage plants and breweries, tannery and shoe manufacturing, textile factories, printing presses, merchandising firms, chemical and drug factories, soap and cosmetic factories, oil refineries, flour mills, cement plants, pulp and paper manufacturing, scrap metal and steel processing plants, and several other enterprises and industrial lines." End quote. Thus, in the Philippines, Sison makes a distinction in the proletariat between industrial proletariat and other wage earners. But in the imperialist countries, the whole of the proletariat is industrial, and we are the confused ones? Again, this is not a principal question of this debate, but Belisario should really learn to pick his battles. Of course, service workers are proletarians, and part of the modern proletariat which was born in the Industrial Revolution. But to us, it does not make sense to define all proletarians as industrial workers. Belisario tends to start shouting when he is arguing a weak point. He writes, quote, "Apparently, Quinera automatically excludes from the industrial proletariat those sizable working masses employed in major service firms in transport and storage, communications and media, health, and so on. There is no such class as service proletariat mechanically separate from the modern industrial proletariat, as if they are boxed off from the intense class struggles and the aspirations for socialism." End quote. Apparently, Belisario is a charlatan. We argue no such point against the service proletariat being part of the proletariat, that is, the modern working class. We have never claimed there to be a class distinction between different proletarians. The proletariat is one class. But, as Sison did when analyzing the classes of the Philippines, and Mao in his analysis of the classes in China, we acknowledge there to be different strata and sectors of the proletariat. We do not in any way think these sectors to be boxed off from one another. The stratification is more important than the sectorization. That is, the division between upper, middle, and lower strata is more important in our view than the different areas of industries and work of the proletarians. But for the sake of clarity, it makes little sense to claim hospitals and shopping malls to be industry. To be clear, there is only one class, but we would hold that insisting on calling our class the industrial proletariat, and not simply the proletariat, could be quite confusing. We again hold that the most important point to emphasize is that the imperialist countries are imperialist, not that they are industrialized. The workers' militia of Sison and Trotsky. Belisario writes, quote, "But here Quinera turns ballistic again. He argues about strict gun laws in Europe, which of course was not Sison's point. He also wrongly associates Sison's ideas with the creation of Russian workers' militia, which emerged in the extremely revolutionary situation of 1917, and certainly was not just Trotsky's idea, but incorporated into the Bolshevik program. The Red Guards were a creation of the Bolsheviks and the masses, not Quinera's idol, Trotsky." End quote. When people read emotions into the texts of others, it is often a case of what the heart's full of spills out of the mouth. The text of Belisario is full of Quinera goes ballistic and such claims. It spices up the text of Belisario, but the one coming off as ballistic is himself. How he ends up making Trotsky an idol of ours, he does not try to explain. But when we firstly referred to Trotsky, we referred to something concrete, namely the transitional program of his International. Here the Trotskyites wrote, quote, "A new upsurge of the mass movement should serve not only to increase the number of these units, but also to unite them according to the neighborhoods, cities, and regions. It is necessary to give organized expression to the valid hatred of the workers towards scabs and bands of gangsters and fascists. It is necessary to advance the slogan of a workers' militia as the one serious guarantee for the inviolability of workers' organizations, meetings, and press." End quote. This was not proposed for Russia during the revolution as Belisario is talking about, but as a part of the proposed general line of the international workers' movement and program of the Trotsky conspiracy. We were reminded of this when we read Sison's first article, where he wrote, quote, "It is therefore possible to organize proletarians with firearms as sporting gun clubs, as community self-defense organizations, and as voluntary security for public events and structures. But of course, it is unwise to make displays of armed groups of people and at the same time provocatively declare themselves in opposition to the capitalist state, its army, and police." End quote. What Trotsky recommended in 1938 is qualitatively just the same as Sison puts forward. Even the examples mentioned are quite similar. The nature of the transitional program was one of centrism and reformism. It merges two stages into one transitional stage, and merges two types of program, the long-term and the short-term, into one. It is an error typical of Trotskyism. Our position is that this line does not apply for most imperialist countries today. For the most part, armed militias should not be built in the open, even disguised as legal organizations who do not provoke the capitalist state, army, and police. There might be local or national specific characteristics that makes this the correct path, but we would recommend the principles of clandestine work to apply in these matters. In general, revolutionaries should learn how to handle guns, but the question of organizing the masses militarily and arming them is not mainly a question of forming militias or sporting gun clubs and self-defense organizations. If such a movement truly is led by the communists, to do so in the open or semi-openly is in itself a provocation. We hold that communists should absolutely be open with our intent, with our program, strategy, and goals, but our organization must be clandestine and secret. This is sometimes inverted by right opportunists who hide their intent but present their organization for the enemy with no real measures of secrecy. Again, Belisario does not quote our text, but claims we confuse Trotsky's proposal with the Red Guards of the Russian Revolution. The Trotskyist transitional program we referred to had nothing to do with the Russian Revolution, but we uphold that the similarity with Sison's paragraph is striking. On serve the people and the right opportunist line. Belisario writes, quote, "Cunera and his group of Tienfolket lack self-awareness and self-criticalness. Since 1998, which is more than 21 years ago, they have not advanced from a pre-party formation and have not become a revolutionary party of the proletariat or a communist party to lead the proletariat and people in any kind of armed revolution. Their protracted talk about PPW has not yet proven to be any different from the illusion of the social democratic and other reformists about the protracted evolution of capitalism to socialism." End quote. Firstly, the text signed Cunera was not from a group. Cunera supports the Maoist movement of Norway, and thus the movement of Serve the People, Communist League, Tienfolket, but the article is no more a statement from this group than the texts of Sison or Belisario are statements of the Communist Party of the Philippines. The claim that Serve the People are not self-aware or self-critical is baseless. In a statement from 2018, on the ongoing struggle against a rightist line in Serve the People, the League wrote, quote, "The rightist line in the organization has gradually appropriated the word Maoism, but it has never practiced Maoism. It has only in word, but not in action, dedicated itself in serving the people. On the contrary, it has shown itself to be a manipulative opportunism and through revisionism. With this, we declare that we have broken with this line and are in the process of correcting our own faults and developing our work in accordance with the interests of the proletariat and the proletariat's own ideology, Maoism." End quote. When Serve the People was founded, it was a Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought group. It did not from the beginning uphold the universality of People's War. Maoism and People's War was adopted in 2008 in the program of the League, but still it was not defined as in the synthesis of Maoism developed by the Communist Party of Peru and Chairman Gonzalo. In fact, most of the lifespan of Serve the People, the line of the leadership majority seemed quite different from the line of Belisario. Thus, the criticism from Belisario of Serve the People not advancing from pre-party formation is like lifting a stone and letting it go on its own feet. The main obstacle of further development of Serve the People was exactly the line opposing Gonzalo thought and Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, principally Maoism. Never has a Maoist from Norway claimed to be in the forefront of world revolution. It is true that there is no protracted People's War under Maoist leadership in Norway or any other imperialist country. But again, where is the revolution due to protracted legal preparations? And what is the theory that has been applied by the most organizations for the longest time? Honesty in this area will make it very clear that the adherence to People's War as the sole path to liberation is new in comparison. The principal problem of the communist movement in the imperialist countries is the danger of right opportunism. Right opportunism in the form of reformism and social patriotism, and often disguised in the imperialist exceptionalism, claiming the path to revolution must be bloody and violent in the Third World, but one of protracted legalism in the imperialist countries, eventually and only in theory, ending in some kind of rapid revolution. In the question of the main contradiction in the line struggle, in the question between left and right, there is no question where to put Belisario and his promoters.